Welcome to Texas Briefing, where we untangle the policy challenges shaping life in the Lone Star State, one series at a time. And this show is coming to you from Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas. I'm Michael Emerson, a fellow at the Institute and director of our Religion and Public Life program. Today we're doing a very special episode on Texas's hemp industry and the regulations that state lawmakers should be looking at as they address the issue in a special legislative session starting on July 21st. During the regular session earlier this year, the Texas legislature passed Senate Bill 3, a measure that would have banned the possession and sale of hemp products containing THC. THC causes the high associated with marijuana. This would have shut down what has become a massive industry, generating an estimated $5.5 billion in sales. But in a late-hour veto, Governor Greg Abbott rejected the ban and instead called for lawmakers to regulate the substances through measures like barring sales to minors, prohibiting sales near schools and playgrounds, and requiring testing at every phase of production. The measure he called for are actually pretty close with the report the Baker Institute published recently by Katharine Neill Harris and her co-authors Lisa Pittman and Victoria Jelp. So we have Katharine, we have to call her Katie, on the podcast to walk us through the issue and the regulations on hemp that she recommends based on her research. Katie is the Alfred C. Glassell III Fellow in Drug Policy at Baker Institute. She analyzes the impacts of local, state, and national drug laws, and her current research focuses on cannabis regulation and overdose mitigation strategies. As I mentioned, she co-authored a recent report with recommendations for hemp regulation in Texas that should prove eminently useful for anyone trying to understand the issues that we are talking about today and the regulations that we should be considering. So, Katie, first of all, thank you for joining us and welcome.
Thank you, Michael. I'm so happy to be here.
So let's just jump right in. You know, nowadays when you're in Houston, it feels like you could throw a brick and hit a smoke shop that's going to sell hemp products. I can remember when I first came to Houston, that wasn't the case. So how did this happen?
Yeah, it's really just happened over the last few years, and we can really pinpoint the start in 2018. So 2018, in the U.S. Farm Bill, Congress essentially legalized hemp. So prior to 2018, hemp was legal to grow for industrial purposes, but its growth was very heavily regulated by the Drug Enforcement Administration. It was still considered a Schedule I drug like marijuana. The hemp industry for decades said these restrictions are too much. We can't really farm this crop like we should be able to. Please remove these restrictions. In 2018, Congress said, okay, we will. And what they did was they legalized hemp and all of its derivatives. And essentially the main part of the definition that they kept, the main restriction that is that hemp has to have less than 0.3% Delta 9 THC, right? And that's the compound that we typically associate with marijuana. And I think lawmakers were probably thinking, oh, well, as long as we keep this limit there, then we won't be legalizing marijuana. We'll just be legalizing this industrial crop. But that is not what has happened. And there's a few reasons for that. One is that there are many different forms of THC besides Delta 9, Delta 8, Delta 10. You might see those advertised at the many smoke shops that you referenced. All of those exist naturally in the hemp plant, and they can be sort of taken from the hemp plant and chemically modified to increase volume and create these products that you're seeing on store shelves around the state. And so this industry really, over the last few years, has been able to proliferate because of that federal law change.
So that is helpful. I'm going to be learning with all of our listeners as we go here. So thank you so much. Okay, so as I mentioned, in this year's legislative session here in Texas, they passed a total ban, or at least put a bill forward of a total ban on consumable hemp that we then saw Governor Abbott veto. So, two questions really here. Why do you think the legislature and our Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick wanted a ban on these products? Let's start there, and then we'll follow up
Sure.
with Governor Abbott.
So there are very real concerns about some of the products that are on the market, but just take two of those. One is some products being very, very strong, very high in THC, because as I mentioned, that restriction of the 0.3% that only applies to Delta 9, it also allows for like heavier products like edibles and drinks to be on the market that can contain a high amount of Delta 9 because it's a weight-based percentage kind of thing. So if you have a heavier product, you can fit more Delta 9 in it. So one concern was with the potency of the products. The other concern is about how they're made, the chemical processes involved. Some of these things you have to add solvents and acids, right, in order to produce the products that you're seeing on the market. And whether those products are safe is really going to depend a lot on who's making them and the diligence of the manufacturers, which is there's a lot of variability for. And we started getting a lot of reports. There are a lot of parents who kind of said, my kid has gotten these products. They sold them to them when they were underage or even, 22, 23, and they've had, bad episode, a mental health episode from taking these products. I think law enforcement, especially in some of the smaller towns, it was really kind of sounding the alarm about these products and the dangers they were causing. And so I think there's been a lot of attention on this issue. The lieutenant governor has sort of long opposed anything that remotely looks like legalization of marijuana. And so this to him and to Senator Perry, and others who supported the ban, these hemp products, there's no difference in between these and marijuana. So they said we need to put the cat back in the bag and try to rein back in this market because it's really gotten out of hand.
Why then would Governor Abbott veto it?
Yeah, so there's a couple concerns that he mentioned in the veto statement. And the primary one that he mentioned was that, he supported the intent of the law, right, to rein in the industry to prevent access of these products to minors. But he said that the way that the bill was written, it was very vulnerable to legal challenges. And I think that is a legitimate argument. A lot of states that have tried to pass very restrictive measures have had those measures get tied up in the courts. He specifically mentioned Arkansas in his veto statement, they passed a law back in 2023 that's been held up in the courts. It was ironic is that just a couple days after our governor vetoed Senate Bill 3, a court in Arkansas said, "Oh, actually, your bill's fine." But this is, it's a few years later that happened, and in the meantime, the market has just been able to this. The bill that the legislature put in front of Abbott's desk, Senate Bill 3, would have been the most restrictive hemp bill in the US. And so I think very vulnerable to legal challenges, not to say that it wouldn't have survived those challenges, but it would have been held up in court. And during that time, it's very likely that this market would continue. So I think that was his main concern with it.
So we have public figures and elected officials against its sale, and then others for it, or at least supporting it in some way. What is in all of your research and the years you've spent on that? Where have you arrived at or landed at? What's your position?
Yeah, so, I think that what we see from research, if you look at drug policy more generally, is that prohibition doesn't really work. It doesn't reduce demand for drugs, and it doesn't really reduce the supply either. It does make that supply a lot more dangerous. Just to give an example, if you look at the overdose crisis that we have right now, it's fentanyl. That is a byproduct of prohibition. And so if you don't regulate products, illegal drugs are not at all regulated. There's no safety mechanisms. And so taking this market out of the public eye, out from state oversight, could certainly increase the harmfulness of products. You would have fewer, quote unquote, good actors, right? The above board actors are going to exit the market, and you would be left with the less scrupulous folks who are already producing the bad products. So I think that it's important to consider other ways to regulate these things other than banning. Because I will say, we do have a public health interest in limiting the use of these products, in kind of curtailing this industry that has grown out of essentially making a profit, like alcohol or tobacco, making profit off of people using a product more heavily, more often, one that the full health impacts of we just don't fully know.
Okay, a little bit later, we're going to compare to alcohol. And of course, there was a period where we had prohibition with alcohol, but we'll come back to that. So we love to think about Texas, and this is a show focusing on Texas, but maybe it would help us If we take a little bit broader view, you did mention Arkansas, and you also said if Texas Bill 3 had passed, it would be the most restrictive.
Yeah.
What is kind of the landscape nationally on this issue?
Yeah, oh man, it's, quite kind of a mess, really, just all over the place. And we actually do have on our website, we made a map of all of the different state policies. People can check it out if you're interested in seeing what other states have done. But basically, I'll try to put it in big buckets of what the approaches have been because there's a lot of variation. There's some states that haven't really passed any kind of additional restrictions, sort of the way that Texas is right now. There's some regulation in place. They're not necessarily well enforced. There's not really a lot of potency restrictions. A lot of those states have enacted age limits, right? So saying that you can't buy unless you're 21, which again, we haven't done that yet here. And then you have states that have not fully banned all hemp products containing THC because again, then there is a legal question around doing that because of federal law and not conflicting with federal law. But what states have done is they've said, okay, sure, you can sell these products, but you can't make any THC out of a chemical process. You can only sell what's naturally occurring in the plant. And then they'll also limit the amount of THC that a product can have to be so low that essentially a serving would not cause impairment, right? There's a lot of states that, for example, say like a hemp edible couldn't have more than 1 milligram or 2 milligrams of THC. That's unlikely to cause impairment for most people. The other thing that we've been seeing, and Texas doesn't fall into this category because we are not a legal marijuana state, but some states that have legalized marijuana have said, we spent all this time creating this whole system for regulating marijuana. If you want these hemp products, you can go through there. You can sell hemp where marijuana is sold. We'll go the dispensary route. And that's another approach that states have taken. And that's the approach that I think eventually we should all try to get to, treating all cannabis, all THC as essentially the same plant and regulating it as such.
So, yeah, for us uneducated folks like myself, what is the difference between hemp and marijuana?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's interesting because this topic I feel like can get you sort of start to get into the science and the chemistry so quickly, and it can be kind of complex. But the main difference is the legal distinction, right? So hemp is defined as having less than 0.3% delta 9 THC, and marijuana is anything that has more than 0.3% delta 9 THC. If you put a hemp plant next to a marijuana plant, most people would not be able to tell the difference. They look the same. There's very slight differences in the plant's physical features. Most of the marijuana that's grown now is grown to have very high amounts of THC. So there's some differences like that. But essentially, the main difference is that legal distinction around THC that made sense when we were still, a fully marijuana prohibition kind of country and where the focus was just on hemp farming. But we're really in new territory now to the point where I think it's just more useful to think broadly about the cannabis plant and about THC and the cannabinoids that exist within that plant.
Yeah, it does make sense. I mean, you've touched on this, but if we just turn our focus now onto the risks of these products, what are they?
Yeah, so let's start on the THC side, right? And I think one thing that you hear like said all the time, right, around marijuana, it's not your grandfather's marijuana, it's not your uncle's marijuana, that the potency has increased over time. And that is true. The potency of these products has increased. We have some research about the health impacts of marijuana use. We don't have a lot of research on the long-term impacts of heavy use of these highly potent products, right? So, for example, we know that THC can cause some short-term cognitive impairment in adults, right? You use it, maybe you're a little slower to react, and these other kinds of things. Those things tend to go away when you stop using. But again, the long-term health effects are less clear. We do have increasing evidence to show that the impacts of marijuana or cannabis use on the adolescent brain can be significant because the brain is still developing and it can limit development in the prefrontal cortex, which is where you have your impulse control and these other kinds of things. So there are concerns there with the kind of heavy use of these products. The other side to be concerned about is that the way the products are made and what is put in them, right? And let's just use Delta 8 as an example. So if you have hemp, Delta 8 is an isomer of Delta 9, right? So it's just like Delta 9 THC, except it has one slight difference in its chemical structure, but it can cause impairment. And that compound exists naturally in the hemp plant. It's there, but it's in very low quantities, right? So if you just took hemp and smoked it for the Delta 8, it wouldn't make you high because it's not in there in enough amounts. So what happens, you have manufacturers, you take the hemp plant, they extract the Delta 8 from the plant and they combine it with other chemicals to produce higher volume, right? And then they can put that in edibles and drinks and that other kind of stuff. But that process usually involves an acid and a solvent to do it. And, skilled chemists, diligent chemists will take those byproducts back out, right, before they put it into these things that people are going to put into their bodies. But not everybody does that. And that's one of the issues with the oversight and the testing of these products is that a lot of them could have these dangerous byproducts. It's really, we're talking about solvents, lead, mold, pesticides, right? These kinds of things that without proper testing and oversight, people could be taking and consuming, and again, having harmful effects from those things, completely separate from the issues with THC.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's really well said. It brings a lot of clarity. There's a larger question is like, why do humans want to take such things? So what would be the benefits of why people would want to, spend their money on this?
Yeah, I mean, since people have existed, people have looked at ways to alter their mind, right? I mean, that's just a natural human inclination. Some have it more than others, right? But I mean, if you look throughout history, alcohol use, tobacco, cannabis, some of the hallucinogenic plants, I mean, there's thousands and thousands of years of history of using these kinds of things. I think that, when we talk about marijuana or hemp, we're talking about kind of just THC and cannabis. There are some medical benefits from it for different kinds of conditions. The ones that we know the most sort of the strongest research is for things like seizures, nausea, that's associated with cancer and HIV treatments, right? So, nausea and also for chronic pain for some individuals. But you also have a lot of folks with PTSD, for example, who have come to really rely on marijuana, who've said that when they've gotten out of the military and they have PTSD, they were drinking all the time, they were taking opioids and other kinds of drugs, and they've been able to stop doing those things and rely on marijuana or on hemp. And that is very powerful for those folks. And there were a lot of veterans who really opposed the Senate Bill 3 for that reason. But they said, this is something that I take every day. This helps me not drink. This helps me be able to be in public spaces without feeling angry or agitated. And so it can be very helpful for some people.
So, yeah, and if we compare, so alcohol is a drug. Alcohol alters moods and can impair, yet it's so thoroughly accepted across most all Western cultures that we don't think of it as a drug. It's just something most people, adults, do. Like if we compare the effects of alcohol versus hemp, maybe that will help people to get a sense of it.
Yeah. So I certainly do consider alcohol a drug. And you'll hear myself and Bill Martin will always say alcohol and other drugs because they're all substances that can cause harm. There have been studies that have looked at ranking drugs according to the harm that they cause, right? And alcohol by far tends to cause the most harm to society, right? If you look at almost every domestic violence case, for example, when the police are called for a domestic violence incident, I would say 90%, if not more, involve alcohol. It can be a very harmful substance. I mean, it's also harmful for our bodies and, it's been linked to cancer and these other sorts of things. But as you note, Michael, it's been so normalized having a drink to relax. And certainly many people do that and it's completely fine for them. But like any other kind of substance, it does entail risks. One of the things I think that is interesting to note with alcohol and one of the differences, right, is that even we know the harms of alcohol and all of that. But when you go to a liquor store and you buy a bottle of, Jack Daniels or Tito's, whatever it is, you can be confident that every single bottle you buy is going to be the same, that it has the same amount of alcohol, the same ingredients. We don't have that kind of confidence in the hemp market or the marijuana market right now. That's the kind of thing that we want to work towards, right? Where we can have that sort of confidence in what we're getting each time. But it is something that is currently lacking in the industry.
Yeah, big distinction. Yes, that's important. Okay, let's focus in right here, right now on policy. So, state legislature will be having a special session
Mhm.
trying to figure out then what policies, what restrictions. should they put in place? What would you recommend?
Yeah, so we have several recommendations, and I must say that the governor in his veto statement outlined a lot of things that we have in our report. Front and center is limiting the sale of these products to minors and to anyone under 21. I think everybody agrees on that. I think that the hemp industry, for the most part, is also on board with that. We don't want minors to be able to have access to these products, not legal access. And then related to that, restricting advertising for minors, limiting the locations. As you noted, right, you can sort of throw a rock and there's a hemp shop or a gas station that sells hemp products. I live not too far from a middle school. There's, I think, like 3 hemp shops within half a mile of that school. Of course, places have to be located somewhere, right? But I think restricting the locations to not be around schools, I think is really important. I also think related to the youth access, restricting the advertising. You have to be careful about advertising restrictions because some of them can start to infringe on the First Amendment rights of businesses. But you can restrict when there's a public health interest. And so limiting the advertising of these things in outdoor spaces where youth are walking by is, I think, also really important to restrict, to limiting and reducing use among that population who, again, is just so vulnerable while their brains are still developing. And so that's sort of, I would say, number one. Some of the other things to look at, right, are limiting the potency of products. So I mentioned with the Delta 9 and the cap on THC, the 0.3%, that can work with certain kinds of things. It's essentially doesn't matter at all for edibles or for drinks. You have to have a milligram cap. And so capping that maybe at 5 milligrams, for example. Again, I mean, like some states do it at 10, some do it at 5, some do 4, some do 1. There's a lot of different options that lawmakers can choose from. They could consider restricting the sale of hemp-derived products that have used a chemical process to make THC isomers, right? So removing those kinds of products from the market. They also really need to clarify some of the testing requirements. As we talked about earlier, the possibility of contamination in these products with lead or residual solvents. There are regulations on the books related to testing for those things, but it's kind of this quirk in the law where essentially if you test different parts of your product, you don't have to test your final product. And I know that's super detailed sort of point, but it does allow for there to be things on the market that shouldn't necessarily be there. Having labs that we can trust, having them accredited and certified, having mechanisms to remove accreditation from labs that might falsify reports, right, on products. These are enforcement mechanisms. One thing that you'll hear from the hemp industry is that we already have regulations on the books, right? And that the state is not enforcing them. And that is true to a certain extent. They've spent about a third of their revenue over the last 5 years, about a third of the revenue from the hemp program has gone towards enforcement. I don't know where the other 2/3 have gone. I mean, you have to enforce these things. If you don't have the oversight in place, then you're going to have people that run wild. And sort of related to that, we've been talking about alcohol, considering shifting some of this regulatory authority to the Texas Alcohol Beverage Commission. And that's something that some lawmakers have been considering. It's something that some have supported because that agency is just more familiar with oversight of these kinds of products than the Department of State Health Services is. So those are a few things.
Right. And then you do bring up the complexity. I mean, you can bring these policies to bear, but you've got to be able to enforce them. And that's the next step. And hopefully, whatever they come up with, they will be able to enforce them. So let's end with this question. And I'm going to couch this. I was working on some research projects with the University of Louisville, and I was surprised how often they look to Texas to see, well, what is Texas's law on a particular issue? How is Texas dealing with it? Do you see any way in which Texas could become a model for the rest of the country on this issue?
Yeah, well, I think certainly, as you noted, right, a lot of states look to Texas. Texas is a leader on a lot of different policy issues, and they have an opportunity to be a leader on this too. I think, when we were talking a bit earlier about the different models of regulating these products, and states that have already fully legalized marijuana are going to, it's sort of a different path for them, right? But if you look especially at the southeastern part of the country, the states in the southeast, Florida being the one exception, there's a lot of them, they haven't legalized marijuana. They might have a medical program, but not a particularly robust one, right? I think those states in particular could look to Texas as a model for how to do this right if we can get it right.
But it does lend to that why what happens in our state legislature really matters. It's not just for Texas and our 30 million people, but for many other states. So very, very important. Katie, we're so grateful for your time and the expertise you brought. And I also want to thank the listeners for taking their time. Texas Briefing is brought to you by Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, which provides meaningful, nonpartisan policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing Texas, the U.S., and the world. This episode was produced by Karina Zemmel. AV production was led by Kevin Young. You can check out this podcast and others and keep up with our latest research and events at bakerinstitute.org. That's bakerinstitute.org. Thanks so much for joining us.